May 5th, 1968. Hollywood, California. The fiancé of 62-year-old character actor Albert Decker enters his apartment and is horrified to discover him hanging dead inside the bathroom. The bizarre manner in which Decker is found suggests that he was involved in some sort of sadomasochistic sexual activity when he died. The initial ruling is suicide, before it is changed to accidental death, but since valuables appear to be missing from the apartment, suspicion mounts that Decker was a victim of foul play. After that, the trail went cold.
You stupid damn fools! Why did you shoot this employee and let the others get away?
Why did the employee? A percent you list me right here, liar!
Harrigan!
The next time you better plan your massacre more carefully or I'll start with you.
Why didn't you kill Pike when you had the chance?
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest mini-sode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and that soundbite you just heard was from Sam Peckinpah's 1969 classic, The Wild Bunch, which is considered to be one of the greatest westerns ever made. One of the actors you heard in that clip was Albert Decker, who played the role of Pat Harrigan, a railroad detective who places a bounty on the outlaw title characters in the film. This would be Decker's final role, as he died before The Wild Bunch was released. However, it's the very, very strange circumstances of his death which will be the subject of today's mini-sode. We have now entered October, and I have developed a special theme for this month. For the past few years, it's become an annual tradition for me to publish creepy Halloween-themed articles at Crack.com, and I'm pleased to say that another Halloween article from yours truly is going to be published there within the next few weeks. So for the entire month of October, all of The Trail Went Cold's episodes and mini-sodes are going to analyze cases which I have covered in my Halloween-themed articles at Cracked. Today's mystery was featured in my article 7 Unexplained Deaths Which Will Shake Your Faith in Reason, which was published last October. And while Hollywood has had its fair share of creepy, unexplained deaths, I think you'll agree that this is one of the absolute weirdest. But before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it and leave us a rating or review. We now have our own PayPal account and a new donate button on the website for anyone who's feeling generous. If there's anyone out there who feels like making a donation, we would be incredibly flattered and greatly appreciate it. We'll also be sure to give any of our generous donors a shout out on a future episode. We have recently received donations from 2 listeners named Michelle and Robert, so thank you very much, you two, for your generosity. I'd also like to take this opportunity to give thanks to 2 other listeners, Alice and Amber, who have signed up to make recurring monthly donations to this podcast. They're both huge fans, and we are very appreciative of their support. And it's also been a very exciting 2 weeks for The Trail Went Cold, as we actually got featured on BuzzFeed in an article titled 18 Creepy True Crime Podcasts That'll Keep You Up at Night. It was quite amazing to see us listed amongst such other acclaimed true crime podcasts like Serial and Thinking Sideways and Generation Y, and on the basis of this extra exposure, we actually cracked the iTunes charts last week. We made it as far as 78 in the United States, 87 in Canada, and 93 in Australia. It was pretty exciting and surreal to see ourselves ranked on the iTunes charts above popular established podcasts that we've listened to ourselves, so we can't thank you guys enough for all your support. We've only been around for just under 8 months now, but we've come a long way in such a short amount of time. But we wouldn't have been able to do so without our wonderful, loyal listeners, so one more time, thank you very much. So with that out of the way, let's now explore the bizarre demise of Albert Decker. Our story begins in Hollywood in May 1968. Our central figure is 62-year-old actor Albert Decker, who is currently engaged to his fiancée, a fashion model named Geraldine Saunders. The couple are planning to get married very soon. Decker had previously been married for 35 years before he and his wife got divorced in 1964. The couple had 3 children together, but tragically, their 16-year-old son died in 1957 when he was constructing a silencer for his .22 caliber rifle, and the gun accidentally went off and killed him. Decker's acting career spanned 4 decades. He could be considered your quintessential Hollywood character actor, as he never became an A-list star, but he was constantly working and built up a solid filmography of 110 credits. After spending the first 10 years of his career on Broadway, Decker moved to Hollywood and started working in the film industry in the late 1930s. A role which helped get him noticed was when he played the mad scientist title character in the 1940 sci-fi horror film Dr. Cyclops. After that, Decker continued working in film, television, and on stage, and had supporting roles in such classics as The Killers, Kiss Me Deadly, East of Eden, and of course, The Wild Bunch, which turned out to be his final film. The actor earned himself a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1960. It's also worth noting that Decker served a term as a Democratic member of the California State Assembly for the 57th District, and even found himself blacklisted in Hollywood for a while because he was very outspoken against notorious anti-communist Senator Joseph McCarthy. Anyway, on the morning of May 5th, 1968, Decker's fiancée Geraldine Saunders went to his Hollywood apartment. By this point, she had not heard from him in 3 days and had become concerned. She found a series of notes on the door which had been left by Decker's friends, so she decided to leave a note of her own and slid it under the door. Saunders returned to the apartment that evening, but when she discovered that all the notes were still in place, she convinced the building manager to unlock the door and let her inside. Decker did not appear to be in the apartment, but they noticed that the bathroom door was locked and decided to force it open. It was here that they made a horrifying discovery that caused Sanders to faint. Albert Deckard was hanging dead from a leather belt inside the bathtub. But this was no ordinary hanging. In fact, this is one of the strangest death scenes you'll ever hear about. Decker was completely nude and crouched down on his knees in the bathtub with a noose tied around his neck. He also had a scarf over his eyes, a ball gag in his mouth, and his hands were cuffed behind his back. In addition to the belt around his neck, Decker had an additional belt around his waist, which was tied to a rope that also tied his two ankles together and was wrapped around his wrist and clasped in his hand. And it gets even weirder. Decker had a dirty hypodermic needle sticking out of each of his arms, and there were 2 hypodermic punctures on his right buttock. Above these punctures, the word whip had been written on his buttock in lipstick, and a picture of the sun had been drawn. In fact, lipstick was used to write a lot of things on his body, including the words "make me suck," which were on his thorax, the words "slave" and "cocksucker," which were on his chest, and there appeared to be drawings of sun rays around his nipples. Oh, and they also drew a picture of a vagina on his lower abdomen. When the police arrived, they determined that Decker had likely been dead in this strange position for at least 2 days, which caused the lower half of his body to turn purple. However, in spite of the bizarre scene, there were no signs of forced entry in the apartment, and no obvious signs of foul play. So the initial ruling from the police was suicide. Well, obviously, Decker's fiancée and most of his family and friends had a major problem with this ruling, as they claimed that Decker had shown no signs of being depressed or suicidal. But putting all that aside, the main issue is that it seemed outright impossible for Decker to have gotten himself into that position on his own. How does one hang themselves when their hands and feet are bound together behind their back? Sure, I guess it's possible that a professional contortionist could have pulled something like this off, but we're talking about a 62-year-old, 240-pound man. The coroner did not think there was enough evidence for suicide, so he changed the ruling to accidental death. Of course, even if it was accidental, that still didn't explain how Decker could have gotten himself into that position without the aid of another person. And Geraldine Saunders had a pretty logical reason to believe there was foul play involved. Apparently, around $70,000 in cash was missing from the apartment. Decker was planning to use that money as a down payment on a new home for himself and his fiancée, but after his death, it was never seen again. In addition, Saunders claimed that some television equipment and a tape recorder were also conspicuously missing, so she was certain that Decker was the victim of a very weird murder-robbery. But in spite of these suspicions, no evidence was ever found to implicate anyone else in Albert Decker's death, and the case was officially closed. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Now, by this point, I'm sure many of you are probably having flashbacks to a more recent hanging death involving a famous Hollywood actor. In June 2009, the world was shocked to learn that David Carradine had been found in his hotel room in Bangkok. Like Albert Decker, Carradine was naked and hanging from a noose, though in this case, his body was inside a closet. While it was initially speculated that Carradine might have committed suicide, it was eventually determined that he was likely a victim of an accidental death caused by autoerotic asphyxiation. In case you're not familiar with that term, autoerotic asphyxiation is the act of purposely restricting oxygen to your brain for the purposes of sexual arousal. A common sex game for this would involve intentionally hanging or suffocating yourself and cutting off your oxygen supply while you masturbate or someone else gets you off. The idea here is that the risk of possible death functions as a major turn-on. Of course, the intention is to climax before you do any serious damage to yourself, but it's easy to see how something like this can go horribly wrong, and why people have accidentally died from this practice. After Carradine's death, 2 of his ex-wives claimed that he was into self-bondage, so it seemed plausible that an attempt at autoerotic asphyxiation cost him his life. Well, back in the pre-internet world of 1968, the world was nowhere near as familiar with the concept of autoerotic asphyxiation, so if that caused Albert Decker's death, you can understand why everyone would be so baffled by it. When a county coroner actually pitched autoerotic asphyxiation as a possible cause of death, Decker's friends and family denied that he was involved in anything kinky. However, a search of Decker's apartment turned up several items which suggested he was into bondage, such as some chains and whips, leather and rubber outfits, and a collection of S&M pornography. They also found a long list of possible acts of bondage, and it was in Decker's handwriting. These acts included, among other things, hot wax on the nipples and genitals, nipple and penis rings, forcing the victim to tie himself up, and being hanged by the neck from a tree. The most strangely specific item on that list was, walk through the street tied and naked except for a raincoat. A former girlfriend of Decker would also claim that they had performed bondage scenes together, though investigators would establish that she wasn't anywhere near his apartment at the time of his death. So to the shock of everyone who knew him, the evidence suggested that Decker was really into this stuff. But while there were a lot of similarities between the deaths of Albert Decker and David Carradine, Decker's case is still a hell of a lot weirder. Carradine was not hogtied, he did not have obscenities written all over his body, and he did not have hypodermic needles sticking out of his arms. Some people still believe that another person was in Carradine's hotel room with him when he died, and helped him get into the position where he was found, but in Decker's case, it seems outright impossible that he could have staged the entire scene himself. Hypodermic needle marks on Decker's buttock could be seen as evidence that someone injected him with a drug to either kill him or render him unconscious in order to stage the hanging. The perpetrator then went to the trouble of making Decker's death as bizarre as possible to throw everyone off the track and overshadow the fact that they'd stolen a bunch of money and equipment from his apartment. Unfortunately, since Decker was dead for days before he was found, it was impossible to determine what kind of drug he might have been injected with. But it's also possible that his death could have been a legitimate accident and a robbery at the same time. Maybe Decker invited someone over to engage in some kinky sex games, but then things went horribly wrong and he accidentally choked himself to death. Decker's sexual partner may not have had any intention of killing him, but once they discovered that $70,000 in cash was lying around the apartment, they decided to be an opportunist and help themselves to the money, along with his film equipment and tape recorder. But there's one key detail which adds an extra element of confusion to the mystery. The bathroom door was locked from the inside. By all accounts, there was a chain lock mounted on the inside door jamb. Since there were no other exits from the bathroom, theoretically, Albert Decker is the only person who should have been able to lock that door. Since he wouldn't have been able to reach the door from the bathtub, this means Decker would have had to have gotten into his bound hog-tie position all on his own after the door was locked. If it wasn't for the detail about the lock, I think it would be pretty cut and dry that this was an accidental death caused by autoerotic asphyxiation. But as it is, you could probably refer to this case as a locked room mystery, which is a popular trope in detective fiction. How can a person be murdered inside a room which is locked from the inside? Well, I suppose it's possible that reports about the chain lock have been exaggerated over the years to add mystery to this story. Remember, Geraldine Saunders and the building manager had to force the bathroom door open to get inside, which would imply that they busted the lock. With the chain lock broken, it would now be more difficult to determine if it was possible to reach in and lock the door from the outside. Now, in one of the sources about this story I found, it mentioned that one of Decker's friends managed the apartment building, and this friend conveniently disappeared after his death. Because of this, Saunders believed the guy was probably involved. Unfortunately, I cannot find any further details about this. I don't even know if this friend was the same building manager who let Saunders into the apartment and broke down the bathroom door. But if there's any relevance to this angle, I think it forms a really intriguing theory. One thing I've always wondered is how many people knew that Decker had $70,000 in cash inside his apartment, and how well was it hidden? I assume he wouldn't just leave this cash lying around in the open if he invited someone over to participate in an S&M game. It's also worth mentioning that Decker had apparently only been staying in this apartment for a week before his death. But if the building manager was Decker's friend, then maybe Decker trusted the guy enough to let him know he was going to be keeping a large amount of cash there. One theory that I've read online to explain the whole locked room mystery aspect is the possibility that after Decker was killed, someone could have unscrewed the bathroom door off its hinges, chained the lock, and then screwed the door back in place to give the impression that it had been locked from the inside. Granted, that sounds pretty far-fetched, and it seems doubtful that a random thief or intruder or opportunistic S&M partner would go to the trouble of unhinging an entire door and screwing it back in place. But one person who might do that is the building manager, as he might have the necessary equipment and resources to pull off such a complicated scheme without attracting any attention. If he was Decker's friend, maybe he also knew about the guy's proclivity for S&M and figured that staging a scene like this would make Decker's death look accidental. That said, this is nothing more than wild speculation on my part. I know absolutely nothing about this building manager, and the only reason I'm mentioning it in the first place is because Geraldine Saunders apparently had some vague suspicions about him. Overall, I do think that accidental death is the most likely scenario, but if there was foul play involved, this is probably the most likely way it played out. That said, even if there was no foul play and Decker's death was purely accidental, a crime still took place here, as someone out there probably got away with the theft of $70,000. So I believe this case should have been investigated more extensively than it was. Now, this case is nearly 50 years old now, and it's officially closed, but on the chance you have any information to suggest that Albert Decker was murdered, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Also, be sure to check out The Trail Went Cold on Facebook and Twitter. We're now available for download on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so be sure to leave us a rating or review at any of those places, because that will help us garner more exposure and bring in some potential new listeners. We also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. A big thank you to Miguel Foote, who does a great job of editing and assembling this podcast together for me, and also happens to be the managing editor of The Back Row, the website which hosts this very podcast. And of course, a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. You can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at crack.com and listverse.com, and there's plenty of other non-true crime content you can find right here at The Back Row. So thank you all for listening, and join me next week as I provide a brand new full-length episode of The Trail Went Cold.